Night falls differently here. It does not simply arrive, it seeps, slowly, softly, through the canopy of ancient trees, curling between the ferns like a living breath. The forest of Flores Island hums with 1,000 unseen lives. Yet beneath that chorus there is a deeper quiet, an older silence. The air is warm and wet, heavy with the scent of moss and volcanic stone. In the half-light, the earth glows faintly, ash mingled with soil, memory mingled with time, and somewhere in that darkness, something moves. Small footprints press into the damp ground, bare, delicate, almost bird-like. They appear for a few steps, then vanish into the mist as though the forest itself swallowed them. The sound of rustling leaves follows, quick and light. If you were there, standing at the edge of that path, you might mistake it for the passing of a child. But no human child ever lived here, not in this age, not beneath this sky. What you would have seen, if the moon had shown mercy enough to part the clouds, was a tiny figure no taller than your chest, stepping carefully through the undergrowth with a sharpened stick clutched in her hand. She pauses, listens. The forest holds its breath with her. A gecko chirps, and somewhere far off, a wave breaks against volcanic rock. For a moment, she is still, then gone again, swallowed by the dark. That moment, lost to the wind tens of thousands of years ago, is the whisper that reaches us now. The whisper that archaeologists heard when, deep inside a limestone cavern called Liang Bua, they brushed away a thin crust of soil and uncovered bones unlike any they had seen before. A skull, round yet small, absurdly small, no larger than a coconut. At first, disbelief filled the cave louder than any echo. Surely this was a child, or a sick modern human, its growth stunted by disease. Yet as the layers of dust gave way to more bones, as femurs and teeth emerged one by one, the truth began to glow through the dirt. They were tiny, yet human, intelligent, yet doomed. The scientists knelt beside the find in silence. Around them, the cave breathed with the cool breath of ages. The discovery would soon travel around the world, a new branch on our tangled family tree. Homo floresiensis, the small-bodied people of Flores. The media called them the hobbits, though no tale of fantasy could rival the quiet tragedy their bones told. Imagine that cave then, flickering torchlight, the smell of dust and limestone, notebooks trembling in anxious hands. Outside, rain drummed softly on the jungle leaves. Inside, humanity's story was rewriting itself. How could such a creature exist? A being so small, yet capable of shaping stone tools with precision, of hunting, of fire. For centuries we had imagined evolution as a ladder climbing ever upward, each rung taller, stronger, smarter. But these bones broke that illusion. Here was proof that smallness did not mean simplicity. Here was a mirror, shrunken yet clear, reflecting a truth we had forgotten. That intelligence wears many shapes, and that survival has never obeyed pride. Still, the question lingered like smoke. If they were so ingenious, why did they vanish? How could being small, something nature once rewarded, become a death sentence? To answer that, we must listen deeper to the island itself. Flores is not gentle land. Even now, it broods with quiet power, shaped by volcanoes that rise and fall like the breathing of gods. Earthquakes stir beneath its roots. Rivers carve through rock like veins of molten glass. To live here required grace, an ability to read the land's moods. Perhaps that is why these small people endured. Their size, their lightness, allowed them to move swiftly, to need little, to hide easily when the world trembled. For thousands of years, they must have thrived in the rhythm of the island, their fires glowing like scattered stars across the jungle floor. Picture them gathered at night outside Liang Bua. The fire crackles, throwing orange halos on the stone walls. One of them, perhaps the same small woman who walked the forest trail, turns a piece of roasted meat on a stick. The others murmur softly, their voices blending with the rustle of leaves. Behind them, darkness thickens. Above them, constellations drift through the mist. For a heartbeat, it feels eternal. Yet even as they lived in that quiet world, the forces that would undo them were already gathering beyond the horizon. The seas were changing. The climate cooled, then warmed. Across distant continents, larger humans, taller, hungrier, restless, began to spread. To these newcomers, an island of small, strange cousins might have seemed like an echo from the deep past, or perhaps a challenge. But that part of the story lies ahead. For now, stay within the cave where the air is cool and still. Look upon the hollow sockets of that ancient skull, Notice how the bone curves gently inward, delicate as a bird's egg. The archaeologists who found it said it looked almost fragile enough to crumble at a touch. Yet it had endured for tens of millennia. Fragility, it seems, has its own kind of strength. There is something haunting in the proportions of the bones. Tiny wrists, narrow shoulders, legs built for balance rather than speed. They remind us of how many shapes humanity has worn. Once, our species was not alone. The world held many versions of us, each carrying its own spark of reason through the dark. Most have gone silent now, but the silence does not erase them. It deepens the mystery they left behind. In that sense, Homo floresiensis is both a discovery and a question that glows faintly in the imagination, like embers refusing to die out. What was it like to be small in a world built for giants? Did they see us coming? Did they sense, in the trembling of the ground, or the shifting of the wind, that their time was ending? Their story begins with survival, an island species shaped by scarcity, sculpted by isolation, but it ends with disappearance. Between those 2 points stretches a silence thick enough to cradle dreams. When the scientists left the cave each evening, they said the forest seemed to whisper after them. The cicadas grew louder, the air cooler. Sometimes, standing at the mouth of Liangbua, they felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the dark. Not fear exactly, but presence. The sense that the past had not entirely gone, that somewhere, beneath the earth or within memory, small hands still moved through the shadows. That is the heart of this mystery. The bones are not merely relics. They are echoes. They remind us that evolution is not a march toward perfection, but a web of fragile chances. For Homo floresiensis, smallness was once salvation. It allowed them to live lightly, to endure when resources were few. But as the world changed, what had been gift became curse. When the climate grew harsher, when stronger cousins arrived, their small fires flickered in the wind and went out. Still, even extinction leaves traces. The cave remembers, the soil remembers, and perhaps, in ways we cannot measure, we remember too. There is something in the human heart that recognizes the lost, the gentle, the overlooked, the small. Their bones call to us not with grandeur but with tenderness. So, as the night deepens over Flores, let the forest close around you once more. Hear the rain whisper on the leaves. Imagine the small footprints returning, faint but certain, through the mud. Somewhere ahead, the path bends toward the cave, and within it, the faint glimmer of a forgotten fire. It flickers once, then twice, before settling into a steady glow. That light is not theirs alone. It is ours as well. For every time we ask how they lived, how they thought, how they vanished, we are really asking what it means to be human, to be fragile and still endure, to shrink and yet imagine, to know we are small and still reach for the stars. And so the story begins, with a whisper in the dark and a promise that somewhere in that whisper, the smallest among us still breathe. Morning light filtered through the thin veil of jungle mist, touching the mouth of Liangbua Cave like the first breath of an ancient story. On the slopes of western Flores, the mountain rose quietly above the green canopy. Its limestone walls were streaked with centuries of rain, and its opening, wide, patient, waiting, had watched the jungle grow and fade 1,000 times over. To the villagers who lived nearby, the cave was an old neighbor. They called it Guabua, the cool cave, a place where goats sometimes wandered in, and where time itself seemed to rest. Few imagined that inside its dusty silence slept another kind of memory, one older than any myth. In 2003, the excavation team arrived not as conquerors of mystery, but as listeners. Led by Australian archaeologist Mike Morwood and his Indonesian colleagues, they came seeking traces of ancient Homo erectus, the tall wanderers believed to have once roamed these islands. What they found instead would ripple through science like a quiet earthquake. The morning they began digging, the air smelled of wet limestone and earth. Students passed buckets of soil hand to hand, voices low, the scrape of trowels echoing off the cave's high dome. A single shaft of sunlight reached the floor, gilding the dust like powdered gold. Outside, cicadas sang their endless song, but within the cave, sound thinned and time slowed. Each brushstroke was an act of patience, a ritual of uncovering. At first, the discoveries were familiar. Fragments of stone tools, bits of charcoal, animal bones. The team recorded, catalogued, photographed. Another day in the long, quiet labor of archaeology. Then, At a depth of 6 meters, a student's brush caught against something curved and fragile. She paused, unsure whether it was stone or bone. Morwood knelt beside her, peered closer, and for a moment forgot to breathe. The curve was smooth, hollow, unmistakably biological. Slowly, grain by grain, they cleared the soil away until a small skull emerged, nestled like an egg in the earth. It was beautiful in its simplicity, no larger than a grapefruit. The proportions were human: brow ridges, nasal cavity, jawline, but shrunken, delicate. As the realization spread, so did the silence. Every movement in the cave seemed to slow. Dust motes hung suspended in the beam of sunlight, turning the air itself into a soft glow of disbelief. One of the Indonesian researchers whispered, almost reverently, "Kessel sekali." So small. They measured the skull, barely above 30 centimeters in circumference. Even a child's would be larger. Yet the teeth told a different story, worn smooth by age. Whoever this was had lived long enough to chew tough food, to survive winters, to walk the forest paths as an adult. The contradiction pressed against logic. How could a grown human be so tiny? The team gathered around the find, knees pressing into damp soil. Someone recorded the grid coordinates. Another took photographs. Yet beneath the routine procedures ran a current of awe. They were scientists, trained to question, but also human beings confronted with the impossible. The cave seemed to lean closer, listening. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly on the forest leaves. Inside, they worked through the afternoon, uncovering more of the skeleton: ribs, vertebrae, long bones, slender as a child's, but proportioned like an adult's. When they reached the feet, they paused again. The toes curled slightly inward, almost as if frozen mid-step. The bones were thick, strong for their size, shaped for balance on uneven ground. Whoever this person had been, she had walked upright, confidently. That night, as the team sat around their camp table beneath a tarp, the forest hummed with frogs and distant thunder. They spoke in low voices, passing sketches between them. One of the researchers, still shaking her head, said it must be pathology, perhaps microcephaly, a genetic disorder causing a small skull. The others nodded uncertainly. It was easier to believe in disease than in a whole forgotten species. Science, after all, is built on caution, but caution could not quiet curiosity. Over the next days, they uncovered more fragments, each confirming what the first hinted at: a population of small-bodied humans living here as recently as 60,000 years ago. The layers of ash and sediment told a slow, stubborn story. Stone tools lay scattered near animal bones, evidence of hunting and cooking. Bits of charcoal spoke of firelight and meals shared. There was order, intention, life. The cave walls themselves bore witness. Streaks of soot high above the floor suggested smoke from hearths. The smell of damp rock mixed with the faint metallic tang of old ash. When the team switched off their headlamps, darkness wrapped them completely, and in that darkness, imagination filled the void. Tiny figures crouched around a flame, shadows dancing on stone. Back at the field lab, measurements turned into arguments. Could brain size alone define humanity? The skull's cranial volume was a mere 380 cubic centimeters, less than half that of modern humans, and closer to an ape's. Yet the stone tools found nearby were sophisticated. Blades, scrapers, even points fashioned with deliberate symmetry. Someone with such a small brain had carved these with skill and planning. The data clashed like mismatched puzzle pieces, yet the picture they formed was unmistakable. A being intelligent enough to shape its world, and small enough to vanish within it. As reports reached universities abroad, skepticism rose like a tide. Some scientists insisted the bones belonged to a modern Homo sapiens with severe developmental disorders. Others accused the team of overinterpretation, of chasing fame. But Morwood's group persisted, guided by the quiet conviction that discovery should not bend to expectation. They ran CT scans, carbon dating, comparative anatomy. Every test deepened the enigma. The skull was not diseased. Its shape and proportions matched no known human variation. The wrist bones resembled those of much older species, while the pelvis suggested a fully upright gait. In the sterile hum of laboratory lights, wonder wrestled with disbelief. One evening, after a long session of measurement, a graduate student placed the reconstructed skull on the table beside a modern one. The difference was startling. The little skull looked like a child seated next to its parent, yet there was a calm dignity in its contours. The student stared for a long time, then whispered. She must have had thoughts, dreams, fears, just smaller. There is something profoundly humbling about holding deep time in your hands. The scientists who touched those bones felt not triumph, but intimacy, a fleeting bridge between eras. Each groove, each worn tooth, each healed fracture told of survival. Somewhere, 60,000 years ago, a woman no taller than a meter had walked out of the forest, perhaps carrying food, perhaps a spark of fire, perhaps a story she would never tell. As months passed, the evidence grew. A second skull fragment, more bones from different layers, all consistent in size. This was no accident, no singular deformity. It was a population, a people. Slowly, reluctantly, the scientific world began to accept what the cave had whispered from the beginning. There had been another kind of human here, one who lived small but thought big. Yet acceptance brought new questions. How did they reach this island across deep ocean channels? Did they build rafts, or drift by chance on storm-tossed debris? How long had they survived unseen? The more data the team gathered, the deeper the riddle became. Flores seemed to guard its secrets jealously, revealing only enough to entice the next excavation. In the evenings, when the generators died and the jungle reclaimed its sound, the archaeologists sometimes sat outside the cave entrance. They watched the fireflies rise from the grass like wandering spirits. The mountain loomed behind them, its silhouette black against the sky. In those moments, wonder replaced fatigue. They could almost feel the gaze of those small ancestors lingering in the dark, curious about the tall strangers disturbing their rest. Inside Liangbua, the air stayed cool even in the heat of day. Moisture dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing through centuries. The excavation pit glowed under work lamps, a bright wound in the earth. Layer by layer, brushstroke by brushstroke, the team peeled back time, and with every new fragment, the world's map of humanity stretched a little wider. When the official announcement came, headlines blazed across the globe. New human species discovered. Yet the phrasing missed something essential. This was not simply a new species. It was a rediscovery of humility. For generations, we had imagined ourselves alone, the inevitable pinnacle of evolution. The little bones from Flores whispered otherwise. They reminded us that intelligence is not measured in height or skull size, but in the quiet persistence to adapt, to light a fire in a dark cave and survive. Still, not everyone was convinced. Debates filled journals and conferences. Some called Homo floresiensis a myth born of misinterpretation. Others embraced her as proof of humanity's deep complexity. Through it all, Liangbua waited, silent and unchanged. Beneath the mountain, the soil still held more bones, more secrets. One afternoon, months later, the team uncovered a tiny jawbone lying just beside the original skeleton. Its teeth were intact, worn but strong. As they lifted it gently, a cool draft swept through the cave, and dust spiraled in the lamplight. Someone laughed softly, the kind of laugh that trembles between joy and disbelief. The air smelled again of wet stone and old earth, the perfume of revelation. They labeled the specimen, sealed it carefully, and stood together in the fading light. Outside, thunder rolled over the jungle like distant applause. Morwood looked back toward the darkness of the excavation pit, then toward the mouth of the cave, glowing faintly with evening. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "We came looking for ancestors. We found neighbors." The others nodded, but none replied. Words felt too heavy. As night descended, the team packed their tools and stepped out into the rain. Behind them, the cave exhaled a cool mist, as if releasing the breath it had held for millennia. Somewhere within that darkness lay the small skeleton, resting once more under thin layers of dust, waiting for the next light to find it. But as the evidence deepened, so did the mystery. Who were these little people who walked among giants? The island rises from the ocean like a memory refusing to fade. From above, Flores looks small, an emerald curve adrift in the vast blue of Indonesia's seas. But approach its shores, and the illusion of simplicity dissolves. The island breathes heat. It hums with the deep pulse of volcanoes, with the hiss of steam escaping through cracks in black rock. Its coasts are jagged, its heart tangled in rainforest so dense that sunlight itself seems to lose direction. This is no gentle paradise. It is a crucible, a closed world shaped by isolation and chance, a place where nature rewrote its own rules. 60,000 years ago, during the long chill of the last ice age, the world was a different map. Great glaciers gripped the poles, locking away oceans and lowering sea levels. What are now separate islands formed sprawling land bridges across the Indonesian archipelago. but Flores stood apart. Even then, the surrounding channels were deep, dark trenches of water alive with sharks and ancient currents. To reach this island was to cross a barrier few species could survive. Once arrived, they stayed, marooned by the sea, left to face time's slow experiment. The air then carried the scent of salt and ash. Volcanic peaks rose from the jungle, their slopes cloaked in clouds. Rivers braided through valleys, carving ribbons of silver beneath the green. At night the sky blazed with unfamiliar constellations, mirrored in the restless waves. Here, life did what it always does when cornered by isolation. It adapted. On Flores, size itself began to bend. Creatures grew smaller or larger according to the island's stern arithmetic. The great stegodon elephants, once towering beasts on the mainland, dwindled generation by generation until they stood barely a meter tall, gentle, shaggy shadows of their ancestors. Their bones now rest in the same soil that held Homo floresiensis, proof of nature's quiet economy. Large animals became small to survive on limited resources. Small ones, free from predators, swelled into giants. Rats grew as big as cats. Lizards stretched longer than men. It was a world of inversions, a land of opposites where strength meant balance, not power. Imagine walking through that ancient jungle. The ground trembles faintly beneath your feet. Somewhere far below, magma shifts in its sleep. The canopy drips with moisture, vines heavy with orchids and moss. Insects drone, and a rust-red dragonfly darts through shafts of pale light. The air is alive but hushed, as though the island itself is listening. In a clearing, a herd of tiny elephants moves cautiously between the trees, their feet soft against the ash. Their eyes are bright, alert, aware of the shadows watching from the undergrowth. Those shadows belong to another small creature, upright, light-footed, patient. Homo floresiensis learned to live by the island's rules. They became part of this intricate balance, neither conquerors nor victims, but participants in a delicate dance of scarcity and abundance. To them, the miniature elephants were not curiosities, but prey. The giant rats, a source of meat and fur. The volcanoes that frightened later settlers were guides, landmarks in their world. The sea that isolated them also protected them from the chaos beyond. It is easy, from the comfort of the modern world, to imagine their life as simple, even idyllic, a quiet people in harmony with nature. But harmony on Flores was a necessity, not a luxury. The island demanded efficiency in every breath. Resources were finite, few large trees for tools, few animals for food. Over generations, natural selection sculpted smaller bodies that required less to sustain. What would have been a disadvantage elsewhere became salvation here. In that shrinking, life persisted. Scientists call this process island dwarfism, a paradox in evolution's language. Trapped populations, cut off from migration, adapt by becoming smaller to match the island's carrying capacity. It is nature's way of balancing the ledger. On Flores, it created a world of scaled-down wonders. But such balance is fragile, maintained only as long as the island remains sealed from change. The moment new forces enter, the arrival of predators, the rise of temperature, the fall of rain, the equation collapses. And so the island lived in constant tension, abundance at war with isolation. Food was plentiful in seasons of rain, scarce when the volcanoes darkened the sky. Streams swelled and vanished, forests burned and regrew. Life moved to the island's rhythm, a slow pendulum swinging between plenty and hunger. Homo floresiensis must have known this rhythm intimately. They would have read the clouds, traced the scent of ash in the wind, followed migrations of the tiny elephants down from the mountains. Each season wrote lessons into their bones. Picture one of their camps at dusk. The sky glows red from a distant eruption, painting the horizon like a wound. The air trembles with low thunder, though no storm approaches. A family of Flores people gathers near a river, their fire small but steady. They roast a rat over the flames, the smell sharp and earthy. Behind them ferns sway, and beyond that darkness waits. Thick, watchful, eternal. They speak in murmurs, perhaps telling stories of the mountain that sleeps and wakes, of spirits that rise from the sea. To live on Flores was to live surrounded by gods too vast to name. For the scientists who later studied the island's fossils, Flores became more than geography. It was a natural laboratory, a model of evolution under pressure. Here, they saw the same principle repeat itself across species, constraint shaping creativity. What the mainland lost in variety, the island multiplied in adaptation. The pygmy elephants, the giant rats, the small humans, all obeyed the same invisible law. Size was not destiny, it was negotiation. Yet there was another side to the story. Isolation grants stability, but it also breeds vulnerability. When the seas rose again and climates shifted, the balance wavered. The volcanic soil, rich yet volatile, could bury forests overnight. The island that had preserved its inhabitants for millennia could just as easily entomb them. And in that shifting landscape, the small-bodied humans faced choices no other species could comprehend. They had intelligence enough to fear the future, but not power enough to escape it. Still, imagine their resilience. In a world of scarcity, they thrived. Their tools, simple flakes of stone, were crafted with purpose, each edge tuned to a specific task. Their shelters, woven from branches and leaves, blended seamlessly into the forest. When the rains came, they gathered in caves, lighting fires that mirrored the volcanoes outside. They must have looked out at the boiling horizon and felt both awe and belonging. Modern visitors to Flores can still feel echoes of that time. Step inside Liangboa today, and the air changes temperature, dropping into the chill of deep time. The limestone walls bear streaks of minerals that glint like old scars. Outside, motorbikes buzz along the roads. Inside, silence reigns. It is the same silence that once enveloped the island's smallest inhabitants. The silence of endurance. Scientists have found other evidence of the island's peculiar scaling. Enormous stalks that towered over the little humans. Lizards large enough to drag prey into their burrows. It is an ecosystem that reads like a fairy tale in reverse, where giants are birds and dragons, and humans are the delicate ones. But in nature, such fairy tales are written in survival, not sentiment. Every adaptation carries a cost. To be small is to live close to the edge. A missed season of fruit, a flood, a single eruption could erase entire generations. The very trait that kept them alive, smallness, made recovery slow. Populations on isolated islands rarely rebound once they falter. Time, once ally, becomes predator. As the millennia passed, Flores continued its quiet transformations. Volcanoes rose, forests shifted, and the seas that once protected the island grew restless again. Somewhere amid these changes, Homo floresiensis began to dwindle. Perhaps a massive eruption darkened the sky for years. Perhaps rising seas cut off hunting grounds, or perhaps new visitors, larger humans with different fires and sharper stones, landed on its shores. However it happened, the balance broke. The island, unchanged in spirit, went on breathing as it always had. Smoke from volcanoes, rain on leaves, thunder rolling across the black sand beaches. But one heartbeat in its vast history fell silent. The little people vanished, leaving only bones and the faint memory of footsteps. Today, when we call Flores the island that time forgot, it is not because time ignored it. Rather, time lingered here too long, circling endlessly within its forests. Evolution slowed into dreamlike patterns, sculpting life into improbable forms. The island preserved its inhabitants like a secret, then released them to the world when we were ready to listen. And if you stand now on its western cliffs at dusk, you can still sense that ancient tension between abundance and isolation. The sea crashes below, a reminder of distance. The jungle breathes behind you, thick and green, a reminder of persistence. Somewhere beneath your feet lie the fossils of tiny elephants and the bones of tiny humans, both shaped by the same rule: adapt or disappear. The law of Flores is simple and merciless. Everything must fit the island. The strong grow smaller. The fragile learn endurance. Here, survival was measured not by conquest, but by compliance. Those who shrank endured. Those who resisted vanished. Perhaps that is why the island feels so hauntingly alive even now. It holds the echo of a truth older than any species, that life does not grow to dominate the world, but to belong to it. In the endless dialogue between land and creature, Flores spoke softly but with authority. It taught that to be small is not to be lesser. It is to be in proportion with the earth. And so, beneath the shadow of its volcanoes and the whisper of its seas, the island that time forgot became a teacher of humility. Every gust of wind, every ripple on its black shores carries the same quiet lesson, the one that shaped the fate of Flores man. In the balance between too much and too little, between isolation and abundance, lies the fragile heart of survival. Morning comes softly to Flores. The first light slips between the trees like a hesitant thought, brushing the jungle in pale gold. Mist lingers in the hollows, coiling above the rivers where frogs still sing their last nocturnal songs. Deep in the forest, the air hums with life. The clicking of beetles, the tremor of wings, the rhythmic rasp of cicadas rising with the dawn. And in a clearing carved by time, a small family begins to stir. They are Homo floresiensis, the little people of the island, barely a metre tall, slender as children, yet every movement purposeful. Their hair is coarse, dark, tangled with dust and the scent of smoke. When they walk, their feet touch the earth lightly, toes spread for balance, as if the island itself is listening. They are not rushing anywhere. Their lives unfold in rhythm with the forest. The morning hunt begins. 2 of them move ahead, crouched low, eyes sharp. They follow a trail of tiny footprints pressed into the mud. The marks of a giant rat, the size of a small dog. The creature is cautious, fast and dangerous if cornered. But the hunters are patient. They whisper in soft clicks and gestures, the language of coordination. One circles left, the other right, flanking their prey through the ferns. In their hands, they hold stone blades no longer than a finger, crafted from volcanic rock chipped into fine edges. The tools gleam faintly in the half-light, simple but lethal. They were made last night by another member of the group, an older woman with steady hands. She had sat by the fire, striking one stone against another, shaping it by instinct and experience. Each flake, each spark was a small act of understanding, an intelligence that required no words. The rat darts, the hunters spring. A flash of movement, a cry, a heartbeat later. Silence. The prey lies still. The hunters breathe hard but quietly. Their faces unreadable. They carry the carcass back toward the cave, the smell of blood mingling with the sweetness of crushed leaves. Above them, the canopy sways. Sunlight breaking through in fragments, warm as breath on skin. Their cave waits on a slope of limestone. Liangbua, the house of echoing wind. To later archaeologists, it will become a portal to the past. But for them, it is simply home. The entrance yawns wide and dark, framed by vines and moss. Inside, the air cools instantly, thick with the scent of earth and ash. The walls are carved smooth by centuries of dripping water. Firelight flickers along their surfaces, making shadows dance like silent ancestors. A small fire burns at the center. Around it sit 3 figures, 2 adults and a child. The woman who shaped the tools earlier feeds the flames with dry twigs. Smoke curls upward, thin and blue, tracing invisible paths toward the cave's ceiling. The child watches, wide-eyed, clutching a round pebble in both hands. The fire pops softly, and the sound seems to fill the whole chamber. There are no words as we know them here, only murmurs, clicks, and gestures. A shared rhythm of meaning, older than language itself. When one speaks, another nods. When one moves, the rest follow. Their communication is tactile and immediate, woven through glances and motion. They live close, not by choice but by necessity. The cave is both shelter and memory, a place where firelight marks the line between danger and safety. Outside, the sun climbs higher. Heat presses against the jungle and the air grows heavy with scent. Fruit fermenting on the ground, resin bleeding from trees, the metallic tang of wet stone. Cicadas pulse in waves, their sound so constant it becomes invisible. Every sense is awake here. Survival depends on it. The little people have learned to listen not for loud noises, but for absence, the sudden stillness that means a predator is near. Their world may seem miniature, but it is vast in experience. Every sound, every shift in the wind carries meaning. A broken twig is a warning. The smell of smoke from another cave may signal neighbors or intruders. Even the angle of sunlight matters. It tells them how long until the rain. By midday, they gather near the river to drink. The water runs cool and clear, fed by mountain streams. One of them crouches, cupping hands like small bowls. Their reflection ripples. Wide eyes, low brows, a face familiar yet strange. The skull is smaller than ours, the brain about 1/3 the size of modern humans. And yet, behind those eyes, thought flickers. Not the abstraction of philosophy, but the immediacy of life. Where we plan, they sense. Where we build, they adapt. Scientists who later studied their remains would marvel at this paradox. How such a small brain could harbour so much skill. Their tools, their organisation, their ability to hunt and cooperate, all pointed to intelligence beyond expectation. Some called them primitive, others miraculous. But to the Flores people, there was no comparison to be made. They were enough for their world. They knew how to make fire. Perhaps not by striking sparks as we do, but by tending embers carefully, carrying coals wrapped in bark from one camp to another. Fire was their inheritance, fragile and sacred. It gave them warmth, cooked their food, kept away the night. When the rain came and drowned the flames, they guarded the smoking remains until it could live again. As dusk begins to fall, the air cools. Bats flutter from the trees, their cries high and fleeting. The hunters return with fruit and roots gathered from the forest. Children scurry forward, reaching out with excitement. The fire grows brighter, casting orange halos on the cave walls. Shadows lengthen and merge, blurring the line between present and memory. A man sits apart, shaping another blade. His fingers move with unconscious precision. Tap, turn, flake. Tiny shards of stone fall around him like grey snow. The sound of each strike echoes in the cave's hollow ribs. Behind him, the firelight catches on carvings in the stone. Not deliberate art, perhaps, but scratches that form patterns, repeating lines like early language. Their world is measured not in years but in moments. The hunt, the fire, the storm. And yet, within that simplicity, there is grace. Cooperation is survival. Tenderness, too, has its place. The older woman leans forward to share a morsel with the child. The child laughs, a sound as bright as the firelight. For a second, the cave feels eternal, filled with warmth that could outlast any darkness. Night falls fully now. The jungle's voice changes. Cicadas fade. Frogs take over. In the distance, thunder rolls from the mountains, the slow breath of volcanoes stirring in their sleep. The fire crackles, its light painting the limestone ceiling in gold. Smoke rises, mingling with the scent of wet leaves and ash. Somewhere in the shadows, one of them hums softly, a melody without words, perhaps nothing more than comfort. For us, these details are fragments reconstructed from bones and ash, but in the imagination, they come alive. The rhythm of small feet on stone, the flicker of fire against walls that have seen millennia. Each mark left behind is a whisper. We were here. We lived. Their lives were fragile. Any shift in the island's balance could have ended them. Yet they endured for tens of thousands of years, long enough to shape tools, tell stories, raise children. Their intelligence was not about invention, but attunement. They knew their world as intimately as we know our technology. Through constant observation, through care. Think of their hands. Small, strong, clever. The same hands that struck stone into blades also cradled fire, carried food, held one another in the dark. Evolution had shrunk their bodies, but not their ability to wonder. In the glow of the cave, they must have watched the flames leap and thought, if not in words, then in feeling. This is life. This is warmth. This is ours. We often measure greatness by size, by the expanse of the mind or the reach of the body. But on Flores, greatness was measured differently. To be small was to be in harmony with the island. To think small was not to lack intelligence, but to live efficiently, to notice the delicate web that connected everything. Outside, the rain begins. Heavy drops strike the jungle canopy, turning into 1,000 tiny rivers. The fire hisses, but it endures. Smoke thickens, curling toward the ceiling like memory taking form. The people huddle closer, sharing heat, their faces half lit and half lost in shadow. One of them adds another stick to the fire. The flames recover, steady and calm. It is here, in this fragile circle of light, that humanity's story repeats itself. Survival through cooperation, comfort through closeness, hope through flame. We may have grown taller, faster, more complex, but the rhythm of that fire, the need for its glow, has never changed. They sleep as the storm passes outside. Raindrops become whispers. The cave breathes with them. Inhale, exhale, darkness and warmth intertwined. In the silence, you can almost hear their heartbeat, echoing across 60 millennia, soft and stubborn. They were small, so small the world almost forgot them. Yet in their smallness, they captured the essence of what it means to be human, to craft, to share, to endure. And for a time, before the seas rose higher, before the world changed, they had everything they needed. For thousands of years, the island of Flores knew only small footsteps. The rhythms of the forest, the calls of distant volcanoes, the hush of wind through trees, all belonged to the little people. They lived in balance, in miniature harmony with their island, unaware that beyond the horizon, the world was stirring. But time does not stand still, even for islands that seem forgotten. Across the sea, Other humans walked the earth, taller, broader, heavier of stride. Homo erectus, the travelers, the builders of fires and stone. They had conquered continents and outlasted climates, their reach stretching from Africa to Asia. And in time, they too looked toward the islands, across waters that shimmered with both promise and peril. No one knows the exact moment when the first of these giants set foot upon Flores. It may have been a single raft driven by wind and luck, or perhaps a line of islands formed stepping stones during an ancient drought. What we know is that by the time the little people looked up from their fires, something had changed. It began perhaps with a sound, faint but unmistakable, a rhythm the forest had never heard before. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crushing the leaf litter. The birds fell silent. The air thickened. The little people froze, their hearts quickening with the instinctive tremor of prey that senses a new predator. For generations, they had been the masters of this miniature realm, small hunters among smaller beasts. But now the balance trembled. From beyond the trees came shadows that towered above them, human, yet not their kind. Imagine that first encounter. It might have been dusk, near the banks of a slow river, the air dense with insects, the water reflecting the last orange slant of sun. On one side, a group of Homo floresiensis crouched among ferns, their small eyes following a flicker of movement across the current. A light, faint, yellow, wavering, fire, not their fire, another one. On the opposite shore, the newcomers stood, taller by half, shoulders broad, their skin catching the fire's glow. They moved differently, more upright, less cautious. The light glinted off tools larger than any Flores hand could wield. The distance between the two groups was narrow in space, but vast in kind. Did they see each other? Did curiosity hold them still, or fear? No fossil record can tell us what passed between them, only that both species lived within overlapping centuries. The bones of Homo erectus predate Floresiensis by nearly 1 million years in Indonesia, and the arrival of Homo sapiens later added yet another shadow to the island's night. The archaeological record whispers of shared ground, stone tools of differing styles, layers of ash that mingle their timelines. But the stories, those belong to the imagination. Perhaps they never met directly, separated by terrain and time, or perhaps they did. A fleeting encounter that left no trace but changed everything. To the little people, the giants must have seemed almost divine. Their fires burned brighter, their weapons sharper. They could cross rivers and hunt beasts beyond the reach of tiny arms. In the dark reflection of those larger figures, Floresiensis might have seen both awe and terror. For what is a god, if not something that can destroy you without meaning to? Imagine a night soon after. The forest restless, smoke hanging in the air, unfamiliar, too heavy, too rich. From their cave, the Flores people watched distant flames rise beyond the trees, fires that burned longer, higher than theirs ever had. The smell carried over the hills. Something new was claiming the land. Days passed. Animals fled the lowlands. Strange footprints appeared in the mud, broad, deep, heavy. A few of the little hunters followed the trail, drawn by both dread and curiosity. They moved silently, each step measured. The tracks led to a clearing where the remains of a fire still smouldered. Large bones scattered, a spear of polished wood half buried in ash. No living figure remained, only the echo of presence. The little people stood there in the orange light of dawn, surrounded by signs they could not read. And perhaps one of them reached out, touching the smooth shaft of that spear. The wood was heavier, harder than anything they could make. The tip glinted with a sharper stone, bound with fibre. For a moment the small hand lingered there, not in fear but in wonder. The world had just become larger, and they had just become smaller. To the giants, whether Erectus or later sapiens, these tiny islanders must have seemed ghostly. Half-human silhouettes glimpsed among trees, quick and quiet as shadows. Some might have mistaken them for children, others perhaps for spirits of the forest. We can imagine the stories they told around their own fires. Tales of the little ones who watched from the darkness, who vanished when approached, who left delicate footprints beside elephant bones. The anthropologist's language for such moments is sterile. Contact, competition, displacement. But the human reality is far more intricate. The island that once offered refuge had become a crossroads of fates. The two species may have competed for the same prey, the same pygmy elephants, the same fruiting trees. They may have scavenged from each other's kills, and where resources grew scarce, fear would have followed. Fear, after all, is as ancient as hunger. In some quiet century, perhaps they shared a cave without knowing it. One group leaving at dawn, another arriving at dusk. Fires built in the same stone ring, the same smoke staining the ceiling in overlapping layers. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would find that soot and puzzle over the timing. But in that long night, all that mattered was survival. And who would keep the fire? When Homo sapiens finally arrived, their presence rewrote the balance entirely. Taller still, minds sharper, eyes full of strategy. They brought with them something invisible but devastating: expansion. Where the Flores people adapted to the island, sapiens sought to master it. Where the little ones lived within limits, the newcomers tested every boundary. The small fires of the islanders faded against the larger blazes that rose across the valleys. The echo of small laughter disappeared beneath the rhythm of new tools striking stone. One species had lived in miniature harmony, the other carried the hunger of the world. Perhaps it was not war that ended the little people, but indifference. The giants did not need to hate them, only to replace them. A shared waterhole drained, a cave taken over, a forest cleared for hunting. Each act, small on its own, added up to extinction. Still, imagine one last moment, the kind that never leaves evidence but feels truer than fossils, a night heavy with rain. The jungle soaked, the air thick with the smell of ash. On a hillside, a small fire burns low. Beside it sits a lone figure, Homo floresiensis, eyes reflecting the flicker of flame. Across the valley, another fire glows, larger, steadier, far away but visible through the mist. The little one watches it unblinking. Lightning flashes, illuminating both camps for an instant. The tiny and the tall, two faces of the same lineage, each unaware that history is closing its hand around them. When morning comes, only smoke remains. The valley is quiet. The giants move on, leaving footprints that will outlast them all. The smaller ones retreat deeper into the mountains, their fires hidden, their voices fading. And somewhere in the thick of that silence, the island itself sighs. Another story absorbed, another species folded into memory. Modern science tries to separate fact from feeling. It asks, did they meet? Did they share blood? Did they leave traces of themselves in us? DNA has given no clear answer. No genetic thread connects us directly to the Flores people. At least, none we can yet find. But perhaps the evidence lies not in molecules, but in myth. Across Southeast Asia, stories persist of the Ibu Gogo, little, hairy people who whispered among trees, who stole food, who mimicked human speech but never quite got it right. To the locals, these tales are not about ancient bones, but about encounters, glimpses of something that once was. Maybe those stories are echoes of a truth older than memory, that the small ones did not vanish all at once, but lingered unseen as the giants spread, that for a while both kinds of humans walked the same island, their shadows crossing, their fires flickering in the same darkness. In the end, dominance won, as it always does. The little people disappeared, leaving behind nothing but their bones, their tools, and the faintest rumor of having existed. The giants continued onward, their footsteps echoing across millennia. But power carries its own loneliness. For the first time in history, the world belonged to one kind of human alone. The silence that followed was not victory. It was absence. And somewhere in the strata of Liangbua, that silence remains, a pause between footsteps, a breath between fires. They were small, and the others were great, but in the end, both were human, each shaped by the same instinct: to survive, to understand, to endure, and perhaps, if the wind catches just right over the jungles of Flores, the island still remembers that meeting, the night when the smallest of humans watched the giants come and knew that the age of peace had ended. The world was changing, though no one alive could name the change. It began not with a roar, but with a whisper, the kind that moves through leaves and lingers over water. The Ice Age was ending. Slowly, the planet exhaled after its long frozen breath, and the rhythm of the earth began to shift. On the island of Flores, the air thickened, the seas swelled, and the quiet balance that had once protected its smallest inhabitants began to unravel. The mornings were no longer as cool. Mist still clung to the jungle canopy, but it burned away faster now under the sharpening sun. Rivers that once tumbled with icy vigor grew shallow, their beds glinting with stones too dry to glisten. Where the forest met the coast, the sea crept forward inch by inch, swallowing the black sands that had long been the domain of the Flores hobbits. It's easy to imagine one of them, a woman, perhaps with a face carved by patience and endurance, standing at the cave mouth one morning, watching as the horizon shimmered not with mist but with heat. She wouldn't have known that the world beyond her island was melting, that glaciers were dissolving into the sea, raising waters that would one day erase paths between islands, sealing her people in isolation once more. To her, it was simply another day that felt a little heavier, the air a little less kind. Across the world, forces far larger than her tiny frame were awakening. Volcanic belts rumbled beneath the ocean. The earth was shaking off its cold skin, reshaping coastlines, drying valleys, turning fertile plains into brittle dust. For the small-bodied species like hers, creatures fine-tuned for scarcity, for balance, such change was not an opportunity, but a slow tightening of the noose. At first, the effects were subtle. Fewer fruits clung to the trees. Streams ran brackish near the coasts. The once abundant pygmy elephants that roamed the island began to vanish, their bones left scattered near shrinking waterholes. Food became a puzzle with missing pieces. The Flores people, with their small stature and modest appetites, were adapted to hardship, but even they could not conjure life from absence. The nights grew uneasy. Fires flickered longer, as though to hold back the sense that something vast was encroaching. The cries of birds grew infrequent. Cicadas still sang, but their chorus now sounded more desperate, more hollow. In Liangbua Cave, smoke curled toward the ceiling, carrying the scent of ash and memory. Every breath seemed to weigh more than it once had. Scientists today can trace this transformation in layers of soil and sediment. They find traces of volcanic dust embedded in ancient rock, a signature of eruptions that darkened skies for months. They see evidence of megafaunal decline, the slow disappearance of the very animals the Flores people relied upon. They can measure drought in the mineral veins of stalagmites, as if the cave itself had kept a record of thirst. But what the rocks cannot tell us is the story of fear. Imagine the nights after the eruptions, the air thick with sulfur, the stars dimmed behind a veil of soot. The forest, once alive with rustles and calls, fell into a silence so deep that even the waves seemed hesitant to break it. For a species barely over 3 feet tall, such darkness must have felt infinite. Their fires, small and precious, were like beating hearts against the void. And yet, for a time, they endured. They always had. Their ancestors had learned to shape tools from stone no bigger than a palm, to hunt small game, to build warmth from little. They had survived isolation, scarcity, and time itself. But the world was growing harsher, faster than their small bodies could adapt. Being small had once been their greatest strength. Less to feed, less to fight for, less to lose. But as the forests thinned and the seasons grew unpredictable, their size became a burden. When prey fled faster, when rivers cut deeper, when storms grew fiercer, smallness meant fragility. A storm would rise over the western sea, black clouds flashing with anger, waves battering the cliffs. The rain came heavy, then vanished for months. Drought followed flood. Heat followed cold. The rhythm of nature broken into chaos. The Flores people, their world built on predictability, faced an enemy they could not see. There may have been one final generation who remembered abundance, who told stories of the rivers that once sang through the valleys. But memory can be cruel. To recall the richness of a vanished world is to carry its loss within you. Their fires, their tools, their footprints pressed into soft volcanic ash, all were gestures of defiance against the weight of the world pressing down. When scientists sift through the sediments of Liangbua, they find no single moment of destruction, no sudden end, no single catastrophe. Instead, they find time stretched thin, like fabric fraying slowly until it disappears. The hobbits did not vanish in a blaze. They faded quietly, piece by piece. The earth, meanwhile, roared on. As glaciers retreated, oceans surged forward. Islands like Flores became more isolated than ever. The sea that had once been their boundary became their prison. Across Asia, larger humans, Homo sapiens, were spreading, thriving, adapting to the same changes that undid their smaller kin. Where the hobbits' bodies faltered, ours endured. Where their fires dimmed, ours multiplied. Perhaps somewhere in that final age, a traveller from the mainland set foot on Flores. drawn by the same restless curiosity that carried humans across every ocean. Perhaps they brought new tools, new diseases, or simply new competition. For the Flores people, already weakened by hunger and weather, the arrival of outsiders would have been the final imbalance. Still, there is something profoundly human in their persistence. To imagine them standing in the mouth of their cave, watching storms gather and fade, still tending fires, still shaping tools, is to recognize a familiar defiance. They did not know they were the last of their kind. They only knew the rhythm of survival. Wake, gather, make, rest, repeated until it no longer could be, and so the world turned. The seas rose higher, the forests changed their voices, the island exhaled its last giants and its smallest people alike. The cave fell silent. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists brushed away the dust of that silence, they found the echoes of this long decline written in bone and ash, a skull the size of a child's, resting in sediment that spoke of drought and storm, tools chipped with precision, lying beside the bones of vanished prey. Every discovery whispered the same truth, that life, no matter how small, resists until it cannot. In the end, it wasn't one catastrophe that ended them. It was the accumulation of many, 1,000 small silences layering over one another, until the sound of their lives was lost to time. The weight of the world had grown too heavy for them to bear, and yet within that silence something remains, a trace of their endurance, carried forward not in their bones, but in the shared story of what it means to survive a changing world. As the night deepens over Flores, wind moves through the same trees that once sheltered them. The ocean sighs against the cliffs. The cave still stands, hollow and listening, and if you lean close enough, you might almost hear it. The faint, unbroken rhythm of a world that never truly forgets. In the end, it wasn't one catastrophe, but 1,000 small silences. Night had fallen heavy over Flores. The forest outside Liangbua whispered softly, its voice carried on a wind that smelled of ash and rain. The cave, once alive with chatter and the crackle of many fires, now held only one small flame, trembling against the darkness. Around it, a few shapes moved, silent and slow. Their shadows swayed on the rough limestone walls like ghosts already halfway gone. This was not the beginning of their end. That had come long ago, with the thinning forests, the dying rivers, the vanishing prey. But tonight, here, in the quiet heart of the cave, the end had taken form. It sat beside them, invisible but undeniable, breathing in rhythm with the dying fire. The last of Homo floresiensis, tiny figures in a vast and indifferent world. A woman sits closest to the flame. Her hands are small and scarred, the fingertips flattened from years of shaping stone and striking sparks. The warmth licks across her knuckles as she feeds the fire its last handful of twigs. The wood hisses, damp, reluctant, before catching with a weary glow. She watches the light rise and fall, reflected in her eyes like a memory she cannot name. Behind her, a child sleeps, curled against a pile of woven leaves, chest rising shallow and uneven. Another adult stirs, coughs softly, and then grows still again. The smoke climbs toward the cave's roof, carrying their breath into the hollow dark above. Outside, the forest hums with life that no longer belongs to them. Insects, birds, the faint splash of something moving in the stream. The world goes on, but their rhythm falters. Perhaps they still spoke in murmurs, their language fragile as birdsong, a few words traded over the embers, too soft for history to keep. Or perhaps silence had already claimed that space too. Scientists may never know what sounds passed between them, what names they gave to fire or to loss, but we can imagine it. Voices small as the flame itself, holding close to one another as the night stretched on forever. Once, the cave had echoed with many footsteps, hunters returning with fruit bats, small deer, or birds tangled in nets. The air filled with laughter, with the clicking of stones struck into blades. The fire had been a circle of light and warmth, a promise against the dark. Now the circle was broken. No one would have known this was the last generation. Extinction doesn't announce itself. It comes quietly, disguised as another bad season, another failed hunt. They would have still searched the undergrowth, still waited by the rivers, still believed in morning. But the island had changed beyond their endurance. The larger humans, The ones who walked taller, spoke louder, and carried sharper tools might have already arrived. Perhaps they watched from the tree line, their silhouettes long and strange in the firelight. Perhaps they competed for the same dwindling food, the same sacred shelters. Or perhaps their meeting was peaceful, brief, forgotten by both sides. No bones tell us if they fought or fled, only that one species survived. And it was not the one whose hands now trembled over the dying flame. Theories abound. Some say disease crossed from those new arrivals, unseen and unstoppable, cutting through the small, vulnerable community. Others believe it was simply hunger, that as forests receded and prey grew scarce, even their clever hands could no longer summon enough to live on. And some imagine the crueler possibility, that they were driven out, hunted, erased by their own kin from across the sea. But in this final moment, none of that mattered. What remained was the closeness of bodies around a fire, the sound of breath, the smell of smoke, the warmth of another presence in the dark. That was all they had ever needed, all they had ever known. The woman reaches for a stone blade resting near her feet. Its edge has dulled from use, the flint chipped and uneven. She turns it in her hand, feeling its familiar weight. Once, this blade had shaped food, carved tools, ensured survival. Now it is only a memory, a fragment of purpose in a world that no longer rewards it. She sets it down carefully beside the sleeping child. Outside, thunder rolls far away, a low, endless murmur. Rain begins to fall, hissing as it strikes the cooling earth. The sound reaches the cave like a song half forgotten. The woman tilts her head, listening. It has been a long time since rain felt like a blessing. She leans forward and blows gently on the flame. For a moment it flares, bright, defiant, beautiful. Then it wavers again, shrinking into a trembling point of orange. The shadows surge closer, swallowing the walls that once held their laughter. If time could pause here, it would find a tenderness in the stillness. Not tragedy, not fear, and just a soft acceptance. These small beings, who once walked upright under starlit skies, had lived in harmony with their island, longer than any empire of men would later endure. They had mastered simplicity. They had thrived within their limits. But even the smallest flame needs air to live. The smoke grows thicker. The woman's eyes sting. She lies down beside the child, pulling a woven mat around them both. The fire pops once more, a spark leaping up, then fading. The warmth retreats. Perhaps, in those final minutes, she thought of the forest paths she once walked, of the sound of cicadas swelling at dusk, of the way the sea glowed beneath the moon. Perhaps she remembered others now gone, faces she could no longer name, hands that had once held hers by the same fire. And perhaps, in that flicker of the last flame, she watched her own story end. The cave settles into silence. The rain outside deepens, washing away footprints at the entrance. Ash drifts in faint spirals through the air, falling softly over stone and bone alike. What remains is only the echo of warmth, the ghost of light against the walls. When millennia later the archaeologists arrive, their torches reveal those same walls, still etched with soot, still whispering of lives once huddled here. Their gloved hands brush away layers of dust, uncovering fragments of bone so small they seem almost fragile enough to vanish in the breath of time. Yet here they are, testaments to endurance, to being. The scientists speak in hushed voices, aware that the air itself feels sacred. They find tools, hearths, traces of meals, and they imagine what must have been. They see in the bones the shape of a people who once stood barely over a meter tall, whose world fit entirely within this island, this cave, this firelight, and they wonder what it must have felt like to be the last. Perhaps it was peaceful. Perhaps it was lonely beyond words. But maybe, just maybe, it was both. Because extinction is not only an ending, it's a kind of remembering. The world absorbs what it loses. The forests reclaim it. The stones keep the warmth of every vanished fire. And long after the last breath is drawn, something remains. Not in sound or sight, but in presence. Tonight, if you stood in Liangbua Cave, you might feel it still. The air is cool, the ground damp beneath your feet. Water drips in the distance, rhythmic as a heartbeat. And if you close your eyes, you might see it, that final ember glowing faintly in the dark, as though refusing to surrender. The rain outside has stopped. Mist curls through the entrance, silver in the moonlight. The world is quiet, patient, eternal. The fire is gone, but the warmth lingers, and somewhere, beyond the measure of years, The small people of Flores still keep their vigil, not in body, but in memory. Their story, carried forward by those who found them, burns on in the minds of all who wonder what it means to fade gently from the world, yet never be forgotten. Perhaps, in the flicker of that last flame, they watched their own story end. The hum of the museum lights is constant, low, electric, and sterile. It fills the quiet halls like a mechanical heartbeat. Behind a pane of glass, lit by a single pool of pale light, rests a skull no bigger than a grapefruit. Its hollow eyes stare out across time, past the crowd, past the white walls, past the centuries of silence that once buried it. The label reads, Homo floresiensis, Langbois Cave, Flores, Indonesia. Visitors pause before it, unsure of what to feel. Some lean close, squinting at the delicate bone ridges, the tiny jaw. Others step back, whispering in disbelief. It looks almost human, yet not quite. Familiar and alien all at once. The mind struggles to place it within the story it knows, the story of us. And in that hesitation, something extraordinary happens. The forgotten past begins to whisper again. It began, as all rediscoveries do, with dust and patience. In 2003, a small team led by Australian archaeologist Mike Morwood and his colleague Peter Brown unearthed the first remains from Liang Bua, a nearly complete skeleton of an adult female, barely 1 meter tall. Her bones were fragile but intact, preserved in the cool, damp soil of the cave for over 18,000 years. The team called her LB1. Later, she would earn a gentler name, the Hobbit. At first, no one believed it. The idea that another species of human, small-bodied, small-brained, yet tool-making and intelligent, had survived so recently on an island so remote, was too strange to fit within science's comfortable boundaries. Some experts dismissed it as a hoax. Others suggested the bones belonged to a modern human with a growth disorder, perhaps microcephaly or dwarfism. The academic world braced for controversy, but the bones refused to bend to explanation. CT scans revealed that the skull was not a malformed version of our own. It was something fundamentally different. Its shape, its proportions, the structure of its pelvis and limbs, all pointed toward an ancient lineage, one that branched away from the human family tree long before Homo sapiens ever appeared. The discovery shattered timelines. It forced scientists to reopen the story of human evolution and admit that the ending wasn't as clear as they'd believed. In the cool light of the lab, Peter Brown examined the tiny skull again and again. Each ridge, each suture, each curve seemed to speak of adaptation and survival. The face that once looked out from this bone had lived a life. Hunted, built, burned, dreamed. It had known fear and warmth, hunger and rest, and for all its differences, it had been profoundly human. The contrast was almost poetic. A being once surrounded by the lush heat of tropical jungles was now displayed beneath sterile glass and buzzing light. A creature that had moved by instinct, by firelight and moonlight, was now measured in millimeters and catalogued by name. Yet in that transformation, from life to artifact, it found a new kind of immortality. The museum itself becomes a vessel of remembrance. The cool air smells faintly of dust and preservation chemicals. Shoes echo softly against polished floors. Every sound seems distant, swallowed by the stillness of history. And behind the glass, the skull waits, not as a relic, but as a question. Who were you? How did you live? Why did we forget you? There's something haunting in our fascination with the small and the lost. We build monuments to giants, to conquerors and kings, but it is the fragile remains, the tiny bones, the faint handprints, the almost vanished names that move us most, because in them we sense the echo of ourselves. Scientists often speak of Homo floresiensis in terms of morphology, lineage, taxonomy. They trace the shape of its skull, measure its femur, compare it to Homo erectus and Australopithecus. They map evolution like a family tree drawn in bone. Yet beyond the data lies something quieter and deeper. A feeling that these little people were not a failed branch of humanity, but a mirror held up to our own impermanence. When Mike Morwood first described the find to the world, he spoke not only of evidence, but of wonder. "It changes everything," he said, voice tinged with disbelief. "It tells us we were never alone." Those words linger. We were never alone. It's a sentence that hums through anthropology, psychology, and something even more primal. Because to discover another kind of human, one so different, yet capable of thought and creativity, is to confront the boundaries of what human means. It humbles us. It reminds us that consciousness, empathy, and art may not have been ours alone. Imagine standing before the display case, your reflection faintly visible in the glass. For a moment, the lights catch your eyes, and the hollow eyes of the skull in the same line of sight. Two beings separated by millennia, connected by the same fragile architecture of bone. You feel the quiet weight of continuity. We are all variations of survival. Genetic studies have since tried to locate traces of Homo floresiensis in our DNA. None have been found. Their lineage seems to have ended entirely on that island, without descendants. And yet, in a strange way, they live within us, not in blood, but in awareness. They remind us that evolution is not a straight line of progress, but a branching forest of possibilities. For every species that survived, dozens more flickered and vanished, leaving only questions behind. In universities and research centers across the world, the story of Flores has become a touchstone, a humbling symbol of mystery. Students learn about the island's unique ecology, about island dwarfism, about the interplay between environment and adaptation. They debate whether Homo floresiensis evolved from Homo erectus that shrank over generations, or from an even earlier ancestor that somehow made the impossible sea crossing. Each theory deepens the enigma rather than resolving it, and still, the echo persists. There is an emotional gravity to the discovery that science alone cannot explain. In the sterile glow of the display, beneath the hum of museum lights, something quietly human stirs. The small skull behind the glass becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting not what we were, but what we fear becoming. Forgotten, misunderstood, reduced to fragments. Yet there is beauty in this remembrance. Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, has not disappeared into obscurity. Its bones have reshaped how we define humanity. They remind us that intelligence does not always come in grand form, that resilience often resides in the small, the quiet, the overlooked. Their story speaks not of failure, but of adaptation, of a people who lived in harmony with their world for longer than our own species has yet existed. The world they knew, the flickering caves, the volcanic winds, the chorus of insects in the night, is gone. But their presence endures in every question we ask, every boundary we reconsider. They remind us that humility is a form of wisdom, that even the smallest voice in the dark can change the way we see ourselves. As the museum closes for the evening, the lights dim and the echo of footsteps fades. The hum grows quieter, then still. The skull remains, waiting in its glass case, patient, timeless. Outside, night gathers over the city, just as it once did over the forests of Flores. Perhaps in some quiet, unknowable way, that echo reaches us still, through the glass, through the hum of history, through the bones that bind all of humanity together. And if you listen closely, you might hear it, a whisper that says we were small, but we were here. A reminder that the measure of being human is not size, nor power, nor survival, but memory. The echo in our bones never fades. It simply changes its form, waiting for us to listen again. There is a quiet wisdom hidden in smallness, a truth we often overlook in our towering cities, our vast ambitions, our endless reach for more. The story of Homo floresiensis is not just about extinction, it is about perspective, about what it means to endure, to find balance in a world that rewards power but is shaped again and again by the gentle persistence of the small. For centuries, strength has been our measure of success. We build higher, move faster, consume more. We tell ourselves that the mighty inherit the earth, that to survive is to conquer. Yet, if we listen closely to the whispers of the fossil record, we hear another voice, quieter, older, wiser, reminding us that the great often fall and the humble often remain. When the age of dinosaurs ended, it wasn't the colossal or the ferocious who survived. It was the small, the adaptable, creatures that hid beneath leaves, that scurried through the dark, that found safety in silence. The mammals, barely, noticed in a world ruled by giants, endured where power collapsed. They did not need strength to survive. They needed resilience, patience, and the grace to fit within the world's limits rather than dominate them. And so it was, perhaps, with the little people of Flores. They were small because the island demanded it, an elegant answer to scarcity, a perfect balance between energy and need. Their bones tell a story of harmony, of living within means, of adapting to what the world offers instead of bending it to one's will. Modern humans, for all our brilliance, have rarely known such humility. We reshape rivers, split atoms, build machines that outpace our own thoughts. But somewhere in that climb toward mastery, we lose the rhythm that binds all living things. The rhythm of balance, of listening, of enough. Homo floresiensis teaches us that survival is not always about growth. Sometimes it is about staying small enough to endure change. Sometimes it is about gentleness in the face of chaos. In the soft language of evolution, smallness is not failure, it is finesse. To be small is to be adaptable, to require little, to bend without breaking. It is a kind of wisdom written not in words but in bones, in the curve of a skull, in the rhythm of breath. Imagine, for a moment, that small figure again, standing at the mouth of the cave, beneath the slow-turning stars. The night air is warm. The forest hums with life. Around her, the world is vast and unknowable. Yet she belongs to it completely, not as master or conqueror, but as part of its endless conversation. She takes what she needs, gives back what she can, and when her kind is gone, the island will remember her softly, not as a wound, but as a whisper. There is comfort in that thought, that life, at its truest, does not demand dominance, only participation. The earth does not keep score. It simply remembers those who lived in rhythm with its pulse. In our age of noise and steel, this lesson feels almost forgotten. We celebrate the large, empires, economies, achievements. But the small things hold the foundations of everything we are. The heartbeat, the seed, the atom, the idea. All of creation is built upon the humble. Even our own survival as a species was once fragile and uncertain, a matter of luck and weather and timing. Perhaps the smallest among us remind us that fragility is the price of imagination. To be aware, to dream, to reach beyond instinct. These are not the gifts of the powerful, but of the vulnerable. It is because we can break that we build, because we can fear that we create. Every act of art, every gesture of kindness, every flame lit against the dark, all are born of the same delicate balance that once kept the little people of Flores alive. They too dreamed in their way, of food, of warmth, of safety. Their fires flickered in caves, just as ours do in hearths and cities. And though their bodies were small, their story has travelled farther than they ever could have imagined. It crossed oceans and centuries to find us here, still asking the same questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to survive? Perhaps strength is not measured in how long we endure, but in how deeply we belong. Across nature, smallness has always been the quiet survivor, the bees that pollinate our world, the plankton that cradle the ocean's life, the tiny fungi that return fallen trees to soil, all carry the great weight of continuity. The world's endurance depends not on titans, but on threads. So too in us. Our greatest acts are not the loudest, but the most enduring. A shared story, a moment of compassion, a spark of understanding passed forward. We inherit the same fragility that once defined Homo floresiensis, and perhaps, in that fragility, lies our truest strength. Because to be human is not to stand above nature. It is to stand within it, trembling and temporary, yet aware. The hobbits of Flores remind us that consciousness is not the privilege of the strong. It is the duty of the living, to observe, to feel, to remember. In the grand tapestry of time, their thread is a short one, but it shines. And in that glow, we see reflected all the smallness that has ever mattered. The spark of a match in the dark, the hush before dawn, the quiet persistence of life in impossible places. Science can tell us how they lived, what they ate, how tall they were, but only imagination can tell us what they meant and what they still mean. Their story speaks not from the mouth of power, but from the heart of humility. It asks us to slow down, to look closely, to see that greatness is not measured by size or strength, but by harmony. We are used to thinking of evolution as a ladder, a climb toward perfection. But perhaps it is more like a tree, spreading in all directions, each branch an answer to the same question: how shall we live? The little ones of Flores found their answer in smallness, in balance, in peace. We found ours in expansion. Both paths led to survival for a time. But only one left the island quiet and whole. And maybe that is the lesson we need most. That survival without harmony is only postponement. That to last, we must learn not to conquer the world, but to fit within it. So when you think of Homo floresiensis, do not imagine a failure or an evolutionary dead end. Imagine instead a song sung softly in the jungle night, brief, beautiful, and complete. Their story is a reminder that the world is not kept alive by the strongest, but by those who move gently enough not to break it. And though their fires are long cold, the warmth of their lesson remains. To be small is not to be lesser. To be fragile is not to be weak. To be forgotten is not to be lost. For the world remembers, always, the ones who lived lightly and left, quietly, teaching by example that existence itself is a kind of grace. And in that grace, every creature, great or small, loud or silent, finds its place in the endless forgiving rhythm of life. The cave is quiet again. No voices, no firelight, no sound of tools against stone, only the slow breathing of the earth. A faint drip of water echoing into darkness, the hush of wind brushing across the entrance. Moonlight spills through a narrow crack above, turning the limestone walls silver, and in that dim reflection, the centuries fold back upon themselves. Here, in this hollow beneath the mountain, life once burned small but bright. The same air that moves now through ancient dust once carried the laughter, the footsteps, the heartbeats of those who lived here. Homo floresiensis, the little people, the ones who walked the island's forests when the world was still half in dream. Their bones lie beneath this silence, delicate, almost weightless. A skull the size of a child's, a hand that could curl around a fruit, a foot shaped for climbing trees and walking soft forest paths. They rest not as relics of failure, but as echoes of what it means to live close to the edge of everything, to survive, not by conquering, but by belonging. The cave remembers them in its own language, the rhythm of water against stone, the slow settling of dust, the scent of earth warmed by passing time. It does not mourn, it keeps, for in keeping there is remembrance, and in remembrance there is still life. Outside, the forest of Flores still murmurs with the same ancient song. Cicadas hum beneath the moon. A night bird calls across the valley. Somewhere far below, the sea breathes, that endless, patient tide that once isolated this island from the rest of the world, making it a sanctuary and a prison both. It was here, upon this lonely stage, that smallness became both gift and curse. In a world where food was scarce and space was limited, the little ones thrived by being less, by using less, needing less, asking less. Their size was not weakness. It was wisdom. Yet when the world shifted, when the seas rose and the skies grew strange, the very thing that once saved them became the reason they could not endure. But perhaps extinction is not the right word. Perhaps it is only transformation. For nothing in nature truly ends. The atoms that made their bones drift now through the soil, the trees, the air. The echoes of their firelight shimmer in the starlight above. And in us, in the great wandering descendants who came long after, something of them remains. A quiet knowing, a sense of smallness beneath the infinite. To be small is not to be forgotten. It is to live close enough to the ground to hear the heartbeat of the world. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear it now, beneath the wind, beneath the distant waves. A rhythm soft and steady, as if the island itself is remembering a story it once told the sea. There is peace in this thought, that the ones who lived and vanished here were not erased, but folded into the world they loved. Their tools are dust, their shelters gone, their fires cold, but their presence lingers in the quiet order of things. The soil that nourishes, the roots that anchor, the air that carries the scent of rain, they do not haunt this place. They complete it, and perhaps that is the true end of all stories. Not noise, not triumph, but return. The slow dissolving of form into meaning, the way a flame fades, not with a scream, but with a sigh. Tonight, the cave hums with that same surrender. Moonlight drifts across the stone, glancing over the edges of old discoveries. Fragments of skulls, shards of tools, memories caught in mineral. Every glimmer is a reminder of the fragility that binds us to time. Once, we too will fade like this. Our voices softened, our names forgotten, our stories scattered like ash. And yet, something will remain, not in monuments or machines, but in the quiet gestures that ripple through the living world. A kindness passed forward, a seed planted, a memory shared beneath starlight. In the silence of Flores, it becomes clear that the measure of life is not how long it lasts, but how deeply it connects. The little ones lived close, to the earth, to each other, to the rhythms that sustain. They asked nothing more than what the day could give, and in that simple balance, they touched eternity. Somewhere along the way, we forgot how to live so lightly. We filled the sky with light and the ground with noise. We made ourselves large enough to be seen from space, but small moments, the ones that once held the world together, began to slip through our fingers. Perhaps that is why their story moves us still, because it reminds us that humanity is not a straight line, but a circle. It returns, again and again, to the same questions whispered in the dark. How much do we need? How far can we go before we lose ourselves? In the end, the answer may be found not in progress, but in pause, in listening to the silence that remains after everything else has been said. Close your eyes. Picture the cave once more. The last ember fades to ash. Outside, rain begins to fall, soft as breath. The forest exhales. Somewhere deep within the mountain, a drop of water falls and becomes the beginning of a river. This is how memory begins, quietly, without permission. Scientists uncovered the bones and named them. They measured and debated, trying to fit the little people into our vast understanding of what it means to be human. But the truth of their existence cannot be contained in data alone. It is felt, not known. The sense that life, in all its forms, is both fragile and infinite. Every heartbeat is borrowed. Every breath is a continuation of something ancient. We are all descended from survivors, from those who adapted, who endured, who dreamed against the dark. But somewhere, deep within our bones, the smallest ones still whisper. They whisper of balance, of quiet strength, of lives lived without excess. They remind us that the world is not conquered by the great, but kept alive by the small, by the unnoticed, by the gentle persistence of those who take only what they need and leave space for what follows. And as the night deepens over Flores, the wind carries that whisper through the trees. It slides across the sea, brushes against cliffs, and travels onward, through the ruins of time, into the restless hearts of those who still listen. It does not speak in words, but in feeling, a reminder that even the smallest flicker of life can outshine eternity, if only for a moment. The cave grows darker, the moon drifts behind a cloud, the drip of water slows, and in that final hush there is no fear, only stillness, the same stillness that follows every ending, every dawn, every breath. What remains beneath the silence is not loss, but presence, the quiet persistence of memory itself. And so, the story closes not with a final line, but with a return to the beginning. The sound of wind, the rhythm of the sea, the heartbeat of a world that never truly forgets. Somewhere, beneath that soft and endless silence, the little ones rest, not gone, but folded into the fabric of life. And as you drift towards sleep, the wind still moves through the trees, carrying their whisper. Be small, be kind, be still. For even in silence, we are never alone.